Picture a city. Not a village, not a cluster of huts around a fire, a real city, with thousands of buildings arranged in perfect, deliberate rings, like the growth rings of a tree. Streets radiate outward from a central plaza big enough to hold the entire population at once. Two-story houses line those streets, their walls painted in red and white spirals, their floors warmed by clay ovens, their shelves lined with some of the most sophisticated pottery the ancient world had ever produced. Now picture that same city, every single building inside it, burning at once. Not by accident, not because an enemy attacked in the night. The people who lived there did it themselves, deliberately, methodically, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And then, when the smoke cleared and the ash settled, they rebuilt the exact same city on top of the ashes of the old one. Same layout, same orientation, same rings. And a generation or two later, they burned it down again. This happened not once, not twice, but for thousands of years, across hundreds of settlements, in a part of the world most people couldn't point to on a map. This was a civilization that, at its peak, built the largest settlements on the planet, bigger than anything in Mesopotamia, bigger than early Sumer, centuries before the first pyramid was even imagined. A civilization with no kings, no palaces, no temples, and, as far as archaeologists can tell, almost no weapons. And then it left behind a mystery that historians have been arguing about for over a century. Why would a society spend years building a home, only to burn it to the ground and start again? Today, we're going to dig into the strange, sophisticated, and largely forgotten world of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, the people who, every 60 to 80 years, set fire to everything they had built and called it home. If this is your first time here, welcome to Forgotten Civilizations. This channel exists for exactly this reason, to pull the lesser-known, criminally underrated chapters of human history out of the footnotes and give them the attention they deserve. Not aliens, not lost super-civilizations, just real archaeology, real evidence, and real mysteries that are stranger than fiction. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, stick around and consider subscribing. There's a lot more like this coming. Now, let's go back about 7,000 years. To understand the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, you first need to understand where and when we are. We're in Eastern Europe, in the rolling forest steppe that today spans eastern Romania, the small nation of Moldova, and a wide stretch of central and western Ukraine. This is fertile, well-watered land, threaded by three major rivers, the Siret, the Prut, and the Dniester, with the Carpathian Mountains rising to the west and the Black Sea lying not far to the south. The time frame is even harder to wrap your head around. Most archaeologists place the culture's existence somewhere between roughly 5,500 and 2,750 BCE, though some estimates push the starting point slightly later, around 5,100 BCE. Either way, do the math. This is a civilization that was already old by the time the first dynasties of Egypt began carving their names into stone. Stonehenge hadn't been built yet, the wheel was barely a new idea, and writing anywhere on Earth didn't exist yet. We are deep in what archaeologists call the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, the late Stone Age sliding into the early Copper Age, a time when farming was still a relatively new technology, and metal was a luxury, not a tool everyone had access to. And yet, in this place, at this time, something remarkable was happening. While much of the rest of Europe was still living in small farming hamlets of a few dozen people, the population we now call Cucuteni-Trypillia was experimenting with something that looks, uncomfortably, like urban life, thousands of years before urban was supposed to be possible. Historians sometimes lump this culture in with a broader idea called Old Europe, a term popularized by the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas to describe a network of related Neolithic societies across the Balkans and Eastern Europe that shared certain artistic styles, religious symbols, and, as we'll get into, a fondness for burning their own buildings. Cucuteni-Trypillia wasn't isolated. It was one of the most spectacular expressions of a much wider cultural world, one that traded, intermarried, and shared ideas across a huge stretch of the European landscape, long before anyone called it Europe. But it's also, frustratingly, one of the most overlooked. Ask most people to name a Neolithic European culture, and you'll get blank stares, or maybe a mention of Stonehenge's builders. Cucuteni-Trypillia, despite arguably building the largest settlements anywhere on the planet during its peak, barely registers outside of academic circles in Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova. That's exactly the kind of gap this channel is here to fill. Here's something genuinely unusual about this culture. It was discovered twice, independently, by two different researchers in two different countries, almost a decade apart, and for years, nobody realized they were looking at the same civilization. The story starts in Romania in 1884, near a village called Cucuteni, not far from the city of Iași. Local researchers, including a magistrate and amateur archaeologist named Teodor Buruda, began excavating a site there and uncovered distinctive painted pottery unlike anything seen before in the region, pieces decorated with flowing spirals and geometric bands in red, black, and white. The site was significant enough that it gave its name to half the culture we now study, Cucuteni. Then, in 1893, almost 800 kilometers away, a Ukrainian archaeologist of Czech origin named Vikenty Kvoyka was excavating near the village of Trypillia, south of Kiev, and found something startlingly similar: the same painted pottery style, the same kinds of clay figurines, the same burned house remains. Kvoyka had no way of knowing about the Romanian discovery at the time, so he described this as an entirely new culture, naming it Trypillia after the village. It took years of cross-referencing artifact styles, pottery sequences, and chronology before scholars on both sides of the border realized these weren't two separate cultures that happened to look alike. This was one enormous cultural network stretching across modern Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine that had simply been discovered from two different directions. Out of academic fairness and a fair bit of regional pride on both sides, the culture eventually got the double-barreled name we still use today, Cucuteni-Trypillia, sometimes written Cucuteni-Trypillia. It's a small detail, but it tells you something important about why this civilization stayed so obscure for so long. It was discovered in fragments, in two different national academic traditions, separated by language and, for much of the 20th century, by the Iron Curtain. Soviet-era Ukrainian archaeology and Romanian archaeology developed largely in isolation from Western European scholarship, and a lot of the groundbreaking excavation work, including the eventual discovery of the jaw-dropping megasites we'll talk about shortly, happened using aerial photography and Soviet archaeological techniques that took decades to filter into English-language textbooks. By the time Western archaeology fully caught up to what had been found, the world's attention was already locked onto Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley as the default first civilizations. Cucuteni-Trypillia simply never got its moment in the spotlight, until now. So who, exactly, were the Cucuteni-Trypillians? They weren't a single unified kingdom or empire with one ruler and one capital. Think of them more like a shared cultural sphere, hundreds of related communities spread across a huge territory, connected by a common language family, likely, though not proven, an early Indo-European or pre-Indo-European tongue, a shared toolkit of farming techniques, near-identical pottery styles, and a set of religious and artistic symbols that show up again and again across the entire region. They descended, broadly speaking, from earlier Neolithic farming cultures that had been spreading across Europe from the Near East for millennia. Cultures like the linear pottery culture and the Boyan culture, which brought agriculture, livestock, and settled village life into Eastern Europe in the first place. By the time Cucuteni-Trypillia proper emerges in the archaeological record, these populations had been farming the same general region for well over 1,000 years, and they'd gotten remarkably good at it. Their economy was built on a mix of cereal farming, wheat, barley, peas, lentils, alongside cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. They supplemented this with hunting, fishing in the nearby rivers, and gathering wild plants. Crucially, this was not subsistence farming on the edge of survival. The land they occupied, the forest steppe zone, with its rich black soil, what's now called Chernozem, some of the most fertile soil on Earth, was extraordinarily productive. That agricultural surplus is, in a very real sense, the foundation for everything else we're about to discuss. You cannot build a city of 15,000 people on land that can barely feed 500. The sheer fertility of this region is what made the rest of the story possible. Most Cucuteni-Trypillia communities lived in modest settlements, typically 1 to 5 hectares, home to somewhere between 50 and a few hundred people, spaced with surprising regularity about 3 to 4 kilometers apart from one another, like beads on a string along the river valleys. This spacing wasn't random. It reflects careful, deliberate land management. Communities positioned themselves close enough to cooperate and trade, but far enough apart that each settlement had access to its own farmland, pasture, timber, and water without infringing too much on its neighbors. Even at this ordinary scale, we're looking at a level of long-term planning that doesn't fit the old stereotype of disorganized Stone Age farmers scattered haphazardly across the landscape. But then, starting around 4100 BCE, during what archaeologists call the culture's middle phase, something extraordinary happened. A handful of these communities stopped following the normal pattern entirely. Instead of staying small, they kept growing, and growing, and growing, until they became something the world, as far as we know, had never seen before. This is where the story stops sounding like typical Stone Age village history and starts sounding almost like science fiction. In the forest steppe region of central Ukraine, particularly in the area between the southern Bug and Dnieper rivers, archaeologists have identified a cluster of settlements that are now simply called megasites. And the word mega is not an exaggeration. Take Talyanki, in what's now Cherkasy Oblast in Ukraine. At its peak, around 3700 BCE, Talyanki covered somewhere between 320 and 450 hectares. For comparison, that's roughly the size of a small modern town, packed with somewhere in the range of 2,700 interconnected houses. Population estimates vary depending on the methodology, but serious academic figures place it anywhere from around 10,000 up to over 20,000 inhabitants at its height. Some older, more generous estimates pushed even higher. Talyanki wasn't even alone. Nearby, the site of Maidanetsky covered over 200 hectares and may have contained close to 3,000 structures, with population estimates ranging, depending on whose calculations you trust, from a more conservative 6,000 up toward a startling 46,000 people. Dobrovol'dy is estimated at over 16,000 inhabitants. Nebelivka, another major megasite, covered roughly 238 hectares with around 1,500 houses. Let that sink in for a second. These numbers put some of these Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements in the same population range, and in some calculations, comfortably larger than the earliest city-states of Sumer, the civilization that history books have spent over a century crediting as the literal birthplace of urban life. And these Ukrainian megasites predate the famous Sumerian cities like Uruk by several centuries. So why isn't Talyanki a household name next to Uruk or Ur? Partly, it's geography and politics. These sites sit in present-day Ukraine, and major systematic excavation and aerial survey work didn't really accelerate until Soviet era and, later, post-Soviet research using magnetometry and remote sensing in the 1970s through the 2000s. Partly, it's because of a stricter academic question that's still being debated today. Were these actually cities in the way we usually use that word? This matters more than it might seem. Most archaeologists hesitate to call the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasites true cities, because cities, in the classic definition, usually come bundled with things like clear social stratification, a ruling elite, a priestly class, full-time craft specialists who don't farm, along with monumental architecture like palaces or temples, and often some form of centralized administration or writing. At the megasites, that evidence is conspicuously, almost defiantly, absent. There's no palace at Talyanki, no temple complex towering over the rest of the settlement, no obvious elite housing dramatically larger or richer than everyone else's. Houses are remarkably similar to each other in size and contents across the entire site, suggesting, at least on the surface, a strikingly egalitarian society for a population in the tens of thousands. Instead of a center built around hierarchy, the settlements are organized around something else entirely: concentric rings. Walk, or rather fly over, since this is how archaeologists actually study these sites today, using magnetometers towed behind small aircraft and drones, and you'd see houses arranged in tight ovular rings, several deep, wrapping around a massive open central area. That central plaza, in some sites, is large enough that researchers think it may have been used for keeping livestock safely at night, for seasonal gatherings, or for some kind of communal ceremony, though its exact purpose is still debated. Some excavated buildings within these sites are unusually large and may have functioned as public meeting halls or ceremonial structures, but again, nothing on the scale of a temple complex you'd find in Mesopotamia or Egypt. It's a layout that practically screams planned rather than grew naturally. Settlements this size, this regular, simply do not happen by accident. Someone, or some collective decision-making process, had to coordinate where new households would build, how the rings would expand, how access roads and gaps for livestock movement would be preserved as the population grew into the thousands. And they appear to have done all of this without an obvious chief, king, or central authority directing traffic. This has led to one of the more genuinely exciting debates in Neolithic archaeology over the last 15 years. Were these settlements evidence of a completely different, non-hierarchical pathway to urban life? Proof that you don't need kings and palaces to build a city, that large-scale human cooperation can emerge from the bottom up rather than being imposed from the top down? Some researchers, particularly those working with the University of Kiel's long-running megasite research project, argue exactly this, that Cucuteni-Trypillia megasites represent an independent, low-density form of urbanism, organized through collective decision-making and ritual rather than centralized political control. Other researchers push back, arguing that low-density urbanism might be overselling it, that without clear specialization, without evidence of administrative record-keeping, and without permanent monumental structures, what we're really looking at is something closer to an unusually large agricultural town. Still remarkable, but not quite a city in the fullest sense. The debate is far from settled, and that's honestly part of what makes this such a compelling mystery to dig into. We are looking at thousands of people, living together at urban scale, and we genuinely don't know how they governed themselves. What's just as striking is what archaeologists haven't found much of at these massive sites: weapons. There's surprisingly little evidence of fortification walls, mass graves, or widespread violent trauma on skeletal remains from this middle megasite period. A sharp contrast to what you'd expect from a population of tens of thousands competing fiercely for resources. That doesn't mean Cucuteni-Trypillia society was some utopian paradise without conflict. There is later evidence of fortification ditches and some violence, particularly as the culture entered its final, more turbulent centuries. But for a very long stretch of its history, this was a society that managed to grow to staggering size without leaving behind the archaeological fingerprints of constant warfare that we associate with most early large-scale human settlements. So, enormous population, careful urban-style planning, apparent social equality, minimal evidence of warfare. By any measure, that's already a civilization worth knowing about. And then there's the part that makes it genuinely strange. Before we get to the great mystery this video is named after, it's worth slowing down and actually picturing daily life here, because the texture of it is remarkable in its own right. A typical Cucuteni-Trypillia house was built using what's called wattle and daub construction, a wooden frame, often using split logs or woven branches, packed and coated with clay mixed with straw, then often fire-hardened. Houses ranged from modest single-room structures to genuinely large, multi-room, two-story buildings, something that's easy to take for granted today, but was a significant architectural achievement in the 5th and 4th millennium BCE. Floors were often raised platforms made of clay over a wooden substructure, and the interiors were typically divided into distinct zones: a clay oven or hearth for cooking and heating, raised clay platforms that likely served as beds or benches, storage areas with large ceramic vessels for grain, and in some homes, a raised clay altar or shrine area, often decorated with small clay figurines. The decoration is where this culture really distinguishes itself. Cucuteni-Trypillia pottery is, by any honest assessment, some of the most visually striking ceramic work to survive from anywhere in the Neolithic world. Painted in deep reds, blacks, and creamy whites, the pottery is covered in flowing, hypnotic spiral and meander patterns, sometimes interpreted by researchers as solar or lunar symbols, sometimes as abstracted plant and animal motifs, sometimes, more speculatively, as an early symbolic or proto-writing system, though that idea remains firmly in the realm of hypothesis rather than established fact. Some interior house walls and floors were painted with these same spiral motifs in red and white, suggesting that the inside of a Cucuteni-Trypillia home wasn't just a functional shelter, it was treated as a kind of canvas, an extension of the same artistic and possibly symbolic or protective tradition reflected in the pottery. Alongside the pottery, archaeologists have recovered thousands of small clay figurines, mostly female, with exaggerated hips and abdomens, often interpreted as fertility figures or goddess imagery, tied to agricultural fertility and the cycle of seasons. Though, as with most prehistoric figurine interpretation, we should hold that reading with a healthy amount of caution rather than certainty. Whatever their exact religious meaning, they appear constantly across the culture's settlements, suggesting some kind of shared, widespread belief system tied to fertility, the household, and possibly ancestor or spirit veneration. Economically, this was a sophisticated mixed farming society. They cultivated wheat, barley, and legumes, raised cattle and pigs as their primary livestock, supplemented their diet with fishing and hunting, and by the culture's later phases, were working copper, importing it from sources as far away as the Balkans for tools, ornaments, and weapons. Textile impressions left in clay suggest they wove fabric on simple looms, though no actual cloth survives this far back. We only know it existed because of the ghostly imprint it left behind on wet clay thousands of years ago. Trade networks connected these communities not just with each other, but with surrounding cultures across hundreds of kilometers, exchanging copper, salt, flint, shells, and presumably ideas, art styles, and religious practices as well. This wasn't an isolated pocket of humanity. It was a thriving, interconnected node within the broader, Old Europe cultural world. By any reasonable definition, this was a complex, organized, artistically rich, agriculturally advanced society operating at a scale that, in some settlements, rivaled the earliest cities anywhere on Earth. And it's exactly this society, organized, skilled, and clearly capable of massive long-term planning, that periodically, deliberately, set its own homes on fire. Let's get into the heart of this story. Across Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, and, as we'll get to, across a wider network of related cultures throughout Eastern Europe and the Balkans, archaeologists keep finding the same strange pattern. Houses that were destroyed by fire, not in the chaotic, random way you'd expect from an accidental blaze or an enemy raid, but in a way that looks controlled, repeated, and deeply intentional. The British-American archaeologist Ruth Tringham gave this pattern a name in the 1990s, the burned house horizon. It's not unique to Cucuteni-Trypillia. Related cultures across the Balkans, including the Vinča culture, the Starčevo culture, and others, show the exact same behavior. But Cucuteni-Trypillia provides some of the clearest and most extensively documented examples of it anywhere in the archaeological record. The evidence is genuinely strange once you start examining it closely. At many sites, entire settlements were burned at roughly the same time, not one house catching fire and the flames spreading unpredictably to its neighbors, but what looks like a coordinated, simultaneous burning of structures across the settlement. Layer after layer of burned material gets found stacked on top of each other at the same locations, meaning communities rebuilt directly on top of the ashes of their previous settlement, again and again, sometimes for centuries. The single most dramatic example of this comes from a site called Poduri in Romania, where archaeologists found 13 separate habitation layers stacked directly on top of one another, 13 times, across what may have been many hundreds of years. The same community, or a community descended from it, built, lived in, burned, and rebuilt on the exact same spot, preserving the same general building orientations each time. Most individual settlements seem to have followed a cycle of roughly 60 to 80 years before a major burning event, which lines up, intriguingly, with roughly 2 to 3 human generations. That's not a coincidence anyone has been able to explain away, and it's central to why this mystery has captured so much scholarly attention. And critically, this wasn't a half-hearted or accidental fire. Modern experimental archaeology, yes, researchers have actually built full-scale reconstructions of these houses and deliberately tried to burn them down to study how the process works, has shown that getting a wattle and daub house to burn this thoroughly, hot enough to actually fire and harden the clay walls and floors the way we find them archaeologically, takes an enormous, deliberate amount of fuel. You can't just drop a torch and walk away. Someone has to pack the structure with extra wood, straw, or other combustible material, and tend the fire to make sure it burns hot and long enough to leave the kind of evidence archaeologists are digging up today. This was, in other words, work. Planned, resourced, executed work, not a tragic accident, and in most interpretations, not the result of an enemy attack either, since the burning pattern shows up across so many unrelated dispersed sites in a remarkably consistent way, often without any accompanying evidence of warfare, like embedded weapon points or unburied traumatized skeletons. So now we arrive at the question this entire video is built around. Why? Over more than a century of research, archaeologists have proposed a genuinely wide range of explanations for the burned house horizon. None of them, on their own, fully explains everything we see in the evidence, which is exactly why this remains an open, actively debated mystery rather than a solved case. Let's walk through the major theories, one at a time. This was actually the earliest serious explanation, proposed back in the 1940s by researchers working in Moldova and Ukraine, and it's the most intuitive one. Burned settlements often mean enemies burned them. The problem is that, as research expanded across the entire Cucuteni-Trypillia region and into the related Balkan cultures, the patterns simply didn't fit a warfare explanation. If this were primarily about enemy raids, we'd expect the burning to be inconsistent, concentrated on border regions or vulnerable sites, accompanied by other typical signs of conflict: weapon trauma on skeletons, hastily abandoned valuables, unburied bodies, defensive structures hurriedly built. Instead, the burning shows up almost everywhere across the culture's territory, with a regularity that looks far more like custom than catastrophe. Most researchers today consider pure warfare an inadequate explanation for the majority of burning events, though it likely does explain some individual cases, particularly in the culture's more turbulent final centuries, when fortification ditches and some evidence of violence do appear. A Russian archaeologist named Evgeny Krychevsky proposed a much less dramatic, almost mundane explanation: that burning actually improved the houses. Firing the clay walls and floors of a wattle and daub structure can harden them, make them more weather-resistant, and help control pests, mold, and dampness that would otherwise accumulate in an organic clay and wood building over decades of use. It's a genuinely clever, practical theory, and it might explain why individual building elements were sometimes deliberately fired during construction or renovation. But it struggles to explain why entire settlements, not just individual problem structures, would be burned down all at once, especially when many of the burned buildings show no obvious sign of decay or structural failure beforehand. Related to the structural theory, some researchers, only half joking, based on genuine concerns raised in academic discussion, have pointed out that densely packed settlements of thousands of people, with stored grain, livestock nearby, and organic building materials, would have been a magnet for vermin, insects, and the kind of disease that thrives in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Periodically burning and rebuilding could function as a kind of large-scale, society-wide reset button, a way of clearing out pests, parasites, and accumulated waste before starting fresh. It's a compelling practical motivation, even if it's unlikely to be the entire story. Humans rarely do something this labor-intensive for purely hygienic reasons without some symbolic or social meaning attached as well. This is, today, probably the leading family of explanations, and it comes in several closely related flavors. Vicente Cavoica, the same researcher who first discovered the Trypillia side of this culture back in 1893, proposed early on that houses were burned when an inhabitant died, transforming the home from a place of the living into what he poetically called a home of the dead. More recent researchers, particularly the Serbian archaeologist Mirjana Stevanović, have argued that these buildings were destroyed through deliberate burning for symbolic, ritual reasons tied to the life cycle of the structure itself. The underlying idea is genuinely fascinating, that these societies may have held an essentially animistic worldview in which a house wasn't just a building, it had something like a spirit, a life of its own, born when it was built and due to die after a set span of time, much like a person. Burning the house at the end of that life cycle would symbolically end its existence, while rebuilding directly on top of the ashes could represent a kind of rebirth, the house's spirit, or the household's identity, being renewed in a new structure built on the same hallowed ground. Items inside the house, pottery, tools, figurines, are often found burned and broken inside the rubble, which fits with the idea that these objects were considered part of the house's spirit and were ritually destroyed alongside it, rather than salvaged. Closely related to the domicide theory, some researchers focus less on the house itself dying and more on what happens when a person inside it dies. Instead of burying the deceased and continuing to live in the same home, the theory goes, the household chose to burn the entire dwelling as a funerary act, turning the structure itself into something like a cremation or memorial, a far larger and more dramatic gesture than a simple grave. It would also elegantly explain something archaeologists have long puzzled over. Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements show relatively few burials directly inside settlement boundaries compared to some other Neolithic cultures. If burning the home itself was, in some cases, functioning as the funerary rite, that absence of conventional graves starts to make a lot more sense. This is one of the more intriguing, less commonly discussed theories, but it fits beautifully with everything else we know about this society's apparent commitment to equality. If a household's possessions, accumulated over 60 or 80 years, extra pottery, stored grain, tools, ornaments, were ritually destroyed along with the house every generation or two, that would act as a powerful, built-in check against any one family accumulating significantly more wealth or status than its neighbors over time. In a society that, as we discussed, shows remarkably little evidence of social stratification despite reaching populations in the tens of thousands, a cultural mechanism that periodically resets household wealth to roughly zero could be exactly the kind of social technology that kept inequality from quietly creeping in as settlements grew larger and larger. It's a theory that's hard to prove directly from the archaeological record, but it dovetails strikingly well with the broader pattern of apparent egalitarianism we see at the megasites. Most researchers today land somewhere here. Ancient Origins, summarizing the current state of scholarship, points out that the most widely accepted explanation today blends several of these ideas together. That burning may have been simultaneously practical, sanitary, and symbolic, possibly evolving in meaning over the culture's long, multi-thousand-year history. A society spanning thousands of settlements over nearly 3,000 years almost certainly didn't burn its homes for one single, uniform reason everywhere, every time. Some burnings may have started out as practical or sanitary decisions that, over generations, acquired deep ritual and religious significance. Some may have been straightforward acts of mourning after a death. Some, particularly in the culture's final, more violent centuries, may genuinely have been the result of conflict. The honest, if slightly unsatisfying answer archaeology gives us is this: we don't have a single confirmed explanation, and we may never get one, because the people who actually did this left us no written record explaining their own reasoning. We are reconstructing their beliefs entirely from ash, charcoal, and the layout of burned clay floors, and that's about as close as you can get to genuinely standing at the edge of human knowledge. What we can say with confidence is this: the burning was deliberate, it was widespread, it required real effort and planning, and it was sustained as a cultural practice across an enormous territory for an almost unimaginable length of time. Whatever the full explanation turns out to be, it tells us that this society held a relationship with home, possessions, and the cycle of life and death that looks almost nothing like our own. And that, on its own, is worth sitting with for a moment. It's worth pausing here to underline something important. Cucuteni-Trypillia wasn't a uniquely strange outlier doing this in isolation. The burned house horizon, as Ruth Tringham termed it, shows up across a whole constellation of related Neolithic cultures throughout the Balkans and Eastern Europe. Groups like the Vinča culture, centered in what's now Serbia, the Starčevo culture, and the Dudešti culture, among others. This matters because it tells us that this wasn't a strange local custom unique to one isolated group of people. It was a shared cultural inheritance across much of what Maria Gimbutas called Old Europe, a huge cultural sphere that, before the later arrival of Indo-European-speaking steppe populations, shared overlapping beliefs, art styles, and, evidently, attitudes toward houses, death, and renewal. Cucuteni-Trypillia, with its enormous megasites and centuries of carefully stacked, repeatedly burned habitation layers, simply gives us some of the clearest, most extensively studied evidence of this practice anywhere in the archaeological record. In a sense, this culture didn't invent the burned house horizon, but they may have practiced it more extensively and on a grander scale than anyone else in prehistoric Europe. Every civilization this remarkable eventually faces a question that's almost more haunting than how it lived. How did it end? For Cucuteni-Trypillia, the end wasn't a single dramatic event. There's no single burned layer marking a final, definitive collapse, the way there might be for, say, a city destroyed in one catastrophic war. Instead, between roughly 3000 and 2750 BCE, the culture seems to fade out gradually and unevenly across its territory, region by region, over what was likely centuries rather than years. And just like the burning mystery, the reasons behind this slow unraveling are still debated, with several major theories competing for the strongest evidence. The first and probably most heavily supported explanation is climate. Around 3200 BCE, paleoclimate data, drawn from pollen analysis, soil studies, and other environmental records, shows that Europe's climate shifted toward a significantly colder, drier pattern, part of a broader episode sometimes compared to the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s. For a culture whose enormous megasites depended entirely on intensive cereal farming to feed populations in the tens of thousands, a sustained, multi-generational drought would have been nothing short of catastrophic. Shorter growing seasons and falling yields would have made it increasingly difficult, and eventually impossible, to sustain settlements the size of Tellianki or Maidanetska. It's worth noting that the most severe, brutal phase of this aridification, according to some climate reconstructions, actually intensified later, between around 4,000 and 3,600 years before present, meaning the climate pressure on this region may have continued building well after Cucuteni-Trypillia's classic megasite era had already started winding down, compounding problems that, in some areas, were already underway. The second major factor is the arrival of new populations from the Eurasian steppe, most famously the Yamnaya culture, a highly mobile, pastoral society associated with early use of wheeled wagons, domesticated horses, and a very different, herding-based way of life that was far better suited to surviving in increasingly dry, marginal conditions than Cucuteni-Trypillia's settled, intensive farming was. Genetic studies of later-period Cucuteni-Trypillia remains do show an increasing presence of steppe-related ancestry over time, which tells us this wasn't purely a story of one population violently replacing another. There was clearly substantial mixing, intermarriage, and cultural blending happening as well. That said, the relationship wasn't only peaceful. In some regions, archaeologists have found fortification ditches, hastily built palisades, and arrowheads embedded in walls dating to this final period, a sharp departure from the relatively low conflict picture we see during the megasite era, and a strong hint that, at least in some places, the arrival of new groups brought genuine, violent tension along with it. Some researchers have proposed an interesting middle ground explanation, that as conditions deteriorated, large numbers of people abandoned the megasites and surrounding farmland. By some estimates, 600 to 700 settlements were abandoned across the culture's later history, and didn't necessarily die out, but rather transformed, gradually shifting their economy away from intensive grain farming and toward the more drought-resilient, mobile pastoralism that was already proving successful for their steppe neighbors. Under this theory, Cucuteni-Trypillia didn't so much collapse as it was slowly absorbed and transformed, its population and even some of its cultural practices folding into the wider Yamnaya cultural world that came to dominate the region in the following centuries. The honest, unglamorous truth is that the end of Cucuteni-Trypillia was almost certainly not caused by any single dramatic factor, but by several pressures compounding each other at once. A changing, increasingly hostile climate straining an agricultural system that had been built for more favorable conditions, new populations arriving with a different, more resilient way of life, and, in some places, genuine conflict layered on top of all of it. It's less a story of a sudden fall, and more a story of a way of life slowly becoming unsustainable, region by region, until what had once been the largest settlements in the world simply faded from the landscape, one drought and one migration at a time. So why does any of this matter, beyond simply being a fascinating piece of trivia? A few reasons, honestly. First, Cucuteni-Trypillia quietly challenges one of the most deeply embedded assumptions in popular history: the idea that civilization, as a concept, requires kings, palaces, and rigid hierarchy. For decades, the story most of us were taught treats Sumer as the starting point of urban life, with kingship and large-scale organization arriving as a package deal. Cucuteni-Trypillia's megasites suggest that large, organized, planned human settlements may have existed first, earlier, without that hierarchical package at all. That's not a minor footnote. That's a genuine challenge to one of the oldest assumptions in the study of human history. Second, this is a civilization that managed to sustain tens of thousands of people, organize massive settlements, and maintain relative social equality and low levels of internal violence for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, arguably far longer than most hierarchical civilizations that came after it managed to stay stable. Whatever they were doing, whether it was the burning ritual acting as a social pressure valve, the egalitarian housing pattern, the absence of any obvious ruling class, clearly worked, for a very long time, by some important measures of social stability. And third, and this is really the whole point of this channel, Cucuteni-Trypillia is a powerful reminder that forgotten doesn't mean unimportant. This was, by population and settlement size, arguably one of the largest human societies on Earth at certain points in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE. And most people watching this video had, until just now, never heard its name. That gap between historical significance and modern recognition is exactly the space this channel intends to live in. So that's the story. Or at least, the story as best as a century of careful archaeology can currently piece it together, of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, a civilization that built some of the largest settlements the ancient world had ever seen, organized itself with a degree of equality and planning that still puzzles researchers today, and then, every 60 to 80 years, set its own homes ablaze and rebuilt, again and again, for thousands of years, for reasons we still don't fully understand. Maybe it really was about death and rebirth, homes given souls, and given funerals of their own. Maybe it was about keeping wealth and power from quietly accumulating in any one household. Maybe it was about pests and mold, and simple practicality that over centuries calcified into sacred ritual. Or maybe, and this is probably closest to the truth, it was all of these things at once, shifting in meaning across the thousands of communities and the nearly 3,000 years this culture endured. What we do know is this: somewhere in the fertile river valleys of modern Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, there is ash beneath ash beneath ash, layer after layer, each one marking a community that built something, lived in it, and then chose, deliberately, communally, generation after generation, to let it burn. If you enjoyed digging into this one, this is exactly the kind of forgotten history this channel is built around. Civilizations that built astonishing things and then slipped quietly out of the popular imagination. If you want to keep finding them with me, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.